And welcome everybody to our live webinar, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, May 14th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition publicly demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one in this series, World Trade Center Building 7. This is part two, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence in the structural dynamics and how these towers collapsed. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy. Whoops. Andy, are you here? Let's see.
There we go. Sorry, folks. That Microsoft decided I needed an update, and now my mute button is freezing. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Richard. And just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches which do occur from time to time. And also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. The best way to submit them is go to ae911truth.org. Right on there, you'll see there's a section for continuing education. Click on the live webinars, and you'll see a box to enter them in. I'll also be watching the Facebook broadcast of this on our channel and also the YouTube broadcast to see if, for any good comments or questions that may pop up during this webinar. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks so much. I appreciate that, all of it, and your help too. There's Andy's face. He's the also the disc jockey, our host of 9/11 Freefall, an extraordinary series of interviews that you can see every week. A lot of work that Andy does on behalf of 9/11 work. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get right into it. In terms of the design, some thought it was the crowning achievement of the international style, the Twin Towers, right, by Minoru Yamasaki. Others, Robert Stern, for instance, calls this the gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Compare that to the elegant unfolding massing of the Empire State Building, which was, until the time of the tower's completion, the tallest building in the world. Incredible innovations occurred with regard to these towers, starting with the getting 50,000 occupants in each of these towers to their destination up there wasn't easy. 3 tiers of elevators with 100 cabs in each of these towers. An extraordinary achievement, really, brought on by the massive size of these buildings. But even more so is the engineering achievement that we see in these buildings. We're talking, for instance, up to this time, we had a forest of columns, like in the Empire State Building, severely impacting the ability to lay out offices. So when the Twin Towers were developed, they pushed half the column strength out to the outside, and this developed the lateral resistance against earthquakes and hurricanes. And then in the inside, they had core columns. But first, on the outside, these 3 verticals and 3 horizontals were welded in the factory and then brought out and erected, bolted together. In the inside, we had 47 massive core columns at mid-height here, you see 32 inches by 16 inches. And then between these two structures, really, were placed these floor panels with concrete over the top of these lightweight steel trusses. So we'll come back to these as the vulnerable point at which NIST sought to find the initiation of collapse in these lightweight steel trusses. But what that did design-wise was open up 60 feet on the upper and lower parts of this diagram of open office planning and 35 feet on the left and the right. I mean, this is a huge building. Each floor is an acre in size and 3.8 million square feet in each of these towers. So the open office capability is seen in this expansive view of the interior. And each floor was very similarly designed, those designed for occupants of these office towers. But there's some problems that remained design-wise. For instance, in the 80s, the structural innovations continued, and that opened up these picturesque views of the cityscape below, as opposed to here, you have columns every 3 feet 4 inches marching all the way around the building. Some likened it unto a jail cell, if you will. Lower ceilings also were a problem. Also problems with dated electrical communications and mechanical equipment, which at the time of 9/11 required 2001 had been requiring billions of dollars of upgrading, as well as the abatement of the asbestos, which was required by the city because of federal regulations. The Port Authority was required to spend $5 to $10 billion to get the asbestos out of the building. That was a non-starter, but nevertheless, Larry Silverstein bought this building. All the rest of the buildings, he had developed Building 7, which we looked at last week in this part 2 of this series, part 1. He invested $125 million of his own money, leveraged that to $3.2 billion to acquire these towers and the other buildings in the World Trade Center in a deal that commenced just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. So keep that in mind. Now, let's go back and find out what happened that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
So here in a nutshell, we have the official story that was developed over a whole lot of time, and it didn't come from the gentleman on the street, or maybe it came through him, who had the answer that they had been struggling with for years and years. We'll come back to that. The plane impact, the North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses about 102 minutes later. So a lot of people associate the collapse, the impact of the airplane, the huge explosion, with the collapse of the building. No, in fact, NIST acknowledges that that the jet fuel simply lit a fire, which then lasted, in this case, 102 minutes. But they also acknowledge that the jet fuel was mostly burned up outside, 90% of it outside the building. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. So it simply started the fire. And that's important because we'll be looking at jet fuel in some detail next week. So we have the South Tower hit. Well, that's interesting. South Tower was hit at 9:03 in that morning. It collapses just an hour later. And that was United Flight 175. There were investigations into the disaster, for starting with volunteers, hand-picked volunteers who worked themselves into the FEMA report, finally had $600,000 worth of funding, not much for an incredible disaster like this. But their efforts were hampered, as documented by the New York Times. They didn't have access to the blueprints of the buildings, the site, to do visual inspections, the access to the public for photographs and videos. It was really quite a problem. And NIST took over that investigation in 2002 and came up with $20 million worth of funding. And we'll talk about what they were tasked with versus what they produced in a moment, or in an hour. They're part of the branch of the U.S. government, the Department of Commerce, so which was the head of which was replaced by the Bush administration when they came into power prior to 9/11. And we'll look and see what they came up with. But essentially, their theory is that large quantities of jet fuel caused massive fires, which heated up these floors, which sagged, which then pulled on these perimeter columns. And so that was quite a problem. And so they introduce a 5,000-pound load in their computer model to try to replicate that on every column around the building, to force them to fail in their computer models, to try to, in an attempt to justify this collapse theory called the column failure theory, which essentially turns into a pile driver theory, because this massive section above the column failures then drove the building down to the ground. That's what we're going to talk about today. But let's look at these fires. Were they massive? No, they were virtually going out at the time of the collapses, indicated by the thick black smoke, the extremely small flames, and that they were oxygen starved. And so we use the scientific method at AE 9/11 Truth. We have a question. That's what happens in science. We try to solve a problem. And so this is our way of winnowing error from truth, fact from fiction. We've had it for 100 years in the West or so. Our question is, how did these towers collapse? Well, we do background research. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how these towers came down. Maybe the jet planes did most of the damage. Maybe it was the ensuing fires, or maybe it was the ensuing explosions, for which we'll be looking at a lot of evidence, as well as evidence for the controlled demolition hypothesis. So all of the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our personal political or financial obligations to that might be swaying our objective opinion. The scientific method is all about objectivity. And we have a lack of that in the NIST reports, as we'll be pointing out today. And so we adhere to it rigorously here, representing 3,000 architects and engineers. We test those hypotheses with predictions, with experiments after making predictions. We analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the results in a black box, keeping the architecture and engineering community in the dark about how we might have arrived at our conclusions, which is what was done, as we talked about last week in our series on part 1 of this series on Building 7. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll find NIST's was not, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis, as we're doing today, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated, supported by the experiments, the results, the predictions, and so forth. So let's begin by doing some background research. That's the first step well, one of the first steps, early step in the scientific method. So first of all, we ask ourselves, well, fire is one cause of destruction. Fire is an organic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, and then moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when fire does bring down a building, and we've never had a high-rise brought down by fire prior to 9/11, but say in a wood frame building, it would fall in stages because it's a chaotic process that follows the laws of entropy. It would cause buildings to fall over to the path of least resistance, not down through this tons of structure that's not burned, straight down below it, as the towers in question did. So how would we expect a steel frame building to behave, though, given that one, at least a high-rise, has never collapsed due to fire before 9/11? Well, they built an 8-story building just to see what would happen with massive fires. They tried to get those flames up to 2,000 degrees with incredible quantities of fuel, as you see here. And they determined in their report here that it behaves very well. And we have both steel, fireproof steel, and as you see here, unfireproofed steel, to get the worst absolute case. Let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course. He's referring to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures all of a sudden collapsing, primarily due to fire. So there's a history of fires in steel frames. Let's get familiar with them.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
There's about 6 fires that we can add to this list. There's one last week in the United Arab Emirates, incredibly engulfed skyscraper that didn't collapse also. And this one, it did not collapse either. So I'll write that one down too. So there are buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case earthquakes. The building falls over to the path of least resistance, something you'd expect, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure beneath. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. We recognize the building. It doesn't look like a house of cards, typically, after the collapse. And the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So keep this in mind, because we'll be comparing these features to the features of the collapse of the Twin Towers and these buildings, which did explode, where we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds rapidly expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the intense gases from the explosive ignition, with a solid edge on the outside. This is typical of explosions. And so we have witnesses that hear those explosions. They see those flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story, other than the explosions associated with the impact of the airplanes, and some explosions which they say in the lobby as a result of jet fuel. So we can use explosions to very effectively bring down high rises. The way they do this is to place shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams in the building, thousands of them, and then set them off in a very precise order, usually from the bottom up, but not always. And that brings the building down in a familiar to most of us. We've seen it on TV, for instance, the old hotels in Las Vegas. It's recognizable. So there's only a handful of companies in the US that can accomplish this. And it's associated with a set of features that are fairly common, such as a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, often a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. That's what they want to do, because there's a patterned removal, an ordered removal of column supports. That's how you achieve that symmetry. And that results in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. So there's no deceleration from that resistance because it's been removed, resulting in the total dismemberment of the structural steel system, and therefore limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. We have broken up concrete floors which are necessary because you don't want to have to go back into the building and use jackhammers to break up all those floors. Let the explosives do the work. And so we have charges that are visible at various floors, obviously isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And of course, chemical evidence left behind from these explosive devices. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. And none of these features, well, they amount to destruction with explosives, direct evidence. None of these features are associated with fires, let alone all of them. So if we have any of them, we can be pretty sure we're talking about explosive demolition. If we have all of them, we can be absolutely sure. Now, fires cause structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically, as we noted, and with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So we haven't lost a high-rise ever. Why not? Well, there's some important reasons for this. One is in the dense steel. It's very dense, conducts that heat away from the source, keeping that source, that steel at the source of the heat from ever really getting to its 1200 degree critical temperature, 1200 Fahrenheit, at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. But just to keep that from happening, we also put fireproofing on, 6 times the amount of fireproofing that we would ever need in order to keep that, in order to keep that heat from getting to that temperature. There's only there's only enough fuel in a given area, as NIST even acknowledges, to burn 20 or 30 minutes. So this is 6 times more protection than is needed than that at 3 hours. So, and we also keep them from contractors and architects from building these buildings out of flammable materials, and keep the tenants from bringing into those buildings too much flammable content. This is highly regulated, and we sprinkler them so none of this becomes a problem. And the sprinklers were compromised, as we're told, because of the collapse of the towers damaging the sprinkler mains. So we're told that's contributed to the problem. But that's not a part of our argument today. We're looking at features of controlled demolition. And there's circumstantial and corroborative evidence that can be helpful. Government documentation. You don't just bring down a building. You have to get approvals and so forth, so people know about it. There's foreknowledge of the event. Experts also, after the event, agree that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. With video documentation also, this can be proof of controlled demolition. So what we're about today is to apply that proof to the Twin Towers. Let's begin. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts, not down below like we saw in Building 7? So let's begin. Here's building number 2, the North Tower. It's standing still, and all of a sudden, it moves. It's in motion. There's no staggering, no stopping, no hesitation, no jolt, no evidence of an impact, and then resistance of materials. Let's go to the South Tower. It's standing still, and then all of a sudden it moves suddenly, smoothly down. And how about, is there patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them? Well, interestingly enough, the first responders were recorded, 500 of them, by the city fire commissioner, Thomas von Eschen, to preserve those accounts. And he finally the city was withholding this from the people until the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city of New York to release this information. And we didn't get this information until August of 2005. So this is critical, as you'll see. So these transcripts were actually published in the New York Times, and very important work was done by Graham McQueen, who went through these rigorously, these testimonies of these 118 firefighters. Let's look at a few of them, shall we? Because 118 are talking about sounds of explosions, flashes of light. It's extraordinary. They were there. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to hear this order of events, which is very precise by these professional witnesses, professionals who are credible witnesses. And all of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running underneath my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all four sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor and another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's take a look at the North Tower, see if there's any similarity to a known controlled demolition on the left with a sudden, smooth descent, no hesitation. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper? Should it not have been the first hypothesis that NIST came up with, rather than relegating it to a series of frequently asked questions, very frequently, published years later on their website? They don't support the controlled demolition theory. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. Well, because they're saying, well, controlled demolition would have started at the bottom. Not always, as we'll see later. So lots of problems with their FAQ as well. You ever see professional demolition where they set these charges on certain floors, says this witness, and then you hear pop, pop, pop. That's when I heard that friggin' noise. That's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming up. Initially, it was just one flash. Then his flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and it started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. You know, we actually heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower on the right. A controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. And fire has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11, ever. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions that appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Another loud, earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Do you see any flashes? I said, yes. I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody at that point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it had exploded. Let's listen to these other credible witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
And an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right on me, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there's those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast and explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
There's a tower rather that has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, so they're popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
They were planned to take our building.
Boom, 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 boom. From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Like firecrackers. How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were included in the final report or the draft report of NIST? Not one. Zero. They claim to have interviewed thousands of witnesses. Not those. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, not all controlled demolitions start at the bottom.
Anywhere in this structure, and given the right circumstances,
take a look.
You can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Here's a top-down controlled demolition. So it's certainly possible. Let me make a note here. Hold on a second. Sometimes I think of great ideas to bring you guys. NIST says, well, it's the upper block that drove the rest of the building down to the ground. Well, this is the key part of their theory here, as you'll see. But there's a law of motion called Newton's third law that says, no, there's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. In this case, with the Volkswagen running into a Mack truck, which one's destroyed? Obviously, the lighter, weaker structure. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No, the weakest, lightest part can't possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below. Stronger and stronger and stronger and larger columns as you go every level down. Till mid-level, you got 30 by 16-inch columns, 2 inches thick. And then down at the bottom, you have virtually solid 52-inch by 22-inch columns. So how can they possibly be destroyed by this light part up top? This comes from Zdenek Bazant in Chicago Northwestern University. This theory, he submitted a 4-page paper that just 2 days after 9/11, it's called his crush down, crush up theory. Everybody else was in shock trying to figure out what happened. And yet he's already done the calculations in 2 days in an extremely sophisticated, I'll say, but more obfuscating paper that actually has correct formulas, but the input data is falsified. Let's look at it. We have obfuscation, making it extremely difficult to critique, first of all. A vanishing story completely removes one whole story of columns so that he can develop an artificial impact load on the structure below, which couldn't have existed because those columns were there. Only a few of them, a dozen at the most out of 40, out of 300 columns, were even damaged. And then by the plane. And he doubles the mass up above. He decreases the column strength below by more than 3 times. So the net result, after ignoring the column reserve strength, which is 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be to support this load, the result is that the energy of the falling mass is 4 times greater. The absorption capacity is 3 times less. It's rigged 12 to 1 at the very minimum in favor of a collapse. So no wonder that was ready to go in 2 days, because it remains the key theoretical support for NIST's failure theory. Now, this was challenged, and in challenging it, we have the actual building collapsing at near free fall acceleration measured by David Chandler. And we have Bazant coming in pretty darn close to that actual measured. But in reality, if you don't use fraud to calculate, you find out that the downward momentum is arrested within within 1 second, and then in the second, in second number 2, it's completely stopped, actually. So that's the reality of the situation, and you can calculate it yourself. We'll look at that later on. So these key errors are refuted by engineers like Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns, submitting papers to the American Society of Civil Engineering, challenging the results of Zdeněk Bezant with these 2 papers, and finding that, gosh, the errors were upheld because by the American Society of Civil Engineers, they won't publish them. Why? Well, they found that they were out of scope. Well, wait, how can it be out of scope to reveal the errors in a previously published paper? It makes no sense whatsoever. So this is being refuted in an ethics challenge. And the results should be forthcoming, actually. It's been a long time. They've been delaying and delaying. They're running out of time now. So the question here is, okay, what happens to the upper body above the point of jet plane impacts? Does it destroy the building below? Well, let's look at it. It's being destroyed, but look at it more carefully. Watch the lower red line. It's not pushing the rest of the building down. It's being destroyed itself. In the first 4 seconds, the structure is being basically liquefied. So how does that happen? You know, the Volkswagen is being crushed. The question is, what's crushing it? Looking at the tower in start-stop mode, stop, we have, like the firefighters described, a band of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. And let's take a step back and then see, well, what did NIST say? They said the massive fires were heating up these floors so that they could sag. Well, sagging floor columns don't produce inward bowing on columns. There's a certain force from a catenary arch. It's not enough to pull these columns in, though. So NIST imposed that artificial 5,000-pound load on every column, on every third column, all the way around the building where they're attached to these trusses. But in fact, there were inward bowing columns. Take a look. In this looped video, you can see them. The question is, what's causing them to bow inward? Is it sagging floor trusses? Let's take a step back to the FEMA report, who began to get this part right, because they observed this.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
The core columns let go first, not the exterior columns. Well, wait a minute. What would that mean? Take a look at the antenna. Down 2, up 2, down 2. It's falling at least 10 feet right there. Up 2. Well, what's the antenna sitting on? The antenna sits on the hat truss. What's the hat truss sitting directly on? The core columns. So if the antenna came down first, then that's an indicative that the core columns were failing first. And then the hat truss and the antenna starts to descend. And then as the core columns are falling down, they're pulling on the floor trusses. And then the floor trusses pull on the columns. Something like you see here in this animation, although we don't see the inward bowing in this particular animation. That is a very different theory than NIST's perimeter column failure theory. And by the way, where's the pile that's driving this building down to the ground? None of the photos or videos show an upper section of the building driving the rest of the building down. It is simply gone. And if it were there, how could these remaining core columns stand after that upper part drove them to the ground? These remaining columns simply fall, and they're not turning to dust. There's an explosion below that shakes them, shakes the dust off of them from the pulverized concrete that we're going to be looking at today. If we have a collapse, would it look like this? Does this look like a collapse or a series of explosions? More like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009, right? And like you see here, does this look like a collapse or an explosion? Just put on a different set of lenses and open your thinking to what your eyes are telling you. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse? Not inside the footprint, but in this case, outside, a very destructive set of explosively outward destruction versus the nice neat pile of building 7 that we looked at last week. Let's take a look. In building number 2, the building begins to fall over. So it's falling off of the building below it. So there's asymmetrical damage from that load that's falling off the building. There's asymmetrical damage from the fires up above. There's asymmetrical damage from the impact of the airplane on the columns and the damage there. So with all that asymmetrical damage, how do we get symmetrical damage all the way down the face of the building? It's a non sequitur. Makes no sense. Something else has taken over at this point. Just like the firefighters described, wrapping all the way around the building. Zoom in to this corner. What are we looking at? A collapsing building, which is supposed to be 20 stories up above here, or a series of hundreds of explosions right in front of our eyes. Looking at the lower right, which is the same corner we were just looking at from a different angle. It's rapidly advancing these explosions down the corner of the building almost as fast as the freely falling debris. Almost free fall acceleration. Here's a 207-foot wide building, but the debris is blown outward in a 1,200-foot diameter. So it's fairly symmetrical. It's just outside the footprint of the building. Well outside the footprint of the building, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away. The steel frame is completely broken up, dismembered. It's cut up, ready for loading and shipment. The debris fills the World Trade Center complex. Compare that incredible destruction with a nice, neat implosion. Classic implosion that we looked at last week from Building 7. Something else is going on here, and something else destroying the entire core of World Trade Center Building 6. Another series of explosions recorded in that building. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing in each tower is distributed outside the footprint of the building, well outside, we have to ask ourselves the question, don't we? What's crushing the building? It's not the steel, not 100,000 tons of steel. You say, oh, it might be the floors. We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, let's look at the lateral ejection of building materials from these floors, from these towers. Like you see here, we're talking about 20, 40, even 60 stories down below this collapsing structure. like there. How in the world can this be explained by a collapsing building way, way up above? NIST says, well, this is air being pushed out by that pile driver. Well, first of all, we saw that pile driver itself was destroyed in the first 4 seconds. But also, let's say it was there and there was this big piston pile driver pushing that air down. It had to come out somewhere, right? Well, wouldn't it blow out all those windows in this open office like we saw earlier? Or none of them? Not these highly focalized pinpoint ejections at geometric geometries that look almost engineered. No. And in this case, in the South Tower, on the left side in this looped video, blowing out all almost at once. This is more proof of these explosions. So let's go to physics teacher David Chandler with regard to the analysis of these squibs.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour. That's 160 to 200 feet per second. We're talking explosive speeds, not air pressure speeds anyway. How fast is the building coming down? Let's look at what this free fall really means. Here's on the left a counter, on the right an animation. Here's 4 seconds, 7 seconds, 10 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, the entire building is completely destroyed from top to bottom. Well, what has to happen? Let's go back to David Chandler and look at how fast this is really going.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall, that's almost free fall. It's not slowing down when it meets what? This. There's more steel in the exterior here than glass. It's not even slowing down. It's going faster and faster and faster straight down through that wall of steel, 14-inch square steel tube columns, 3 feet, 4 inches on center. Let's look at it another way. We have on the right the upper section of building held up over nothing but air. On the left, the same section of building held up over 80,000 tons of structural steel framing designed to resist that load 3 to 5 times longer. But we'll just go ahead and take out, just like Zdenek Bazant did, a story of columns and to allow for an impact load. We release these both at once. What happens? Well, a 7th grader can figure this out. A 5th grader can. The structure on the right will fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky and hit the ground in about 9 seconds, free fall. And the one on the left is going to have to impact 80,000 tons of structural steel. It's going to slow down, right, when it does that. Okay, you get the point there. It's not going to be as NIST said it was. In fact, let's look at it this way from Massimo Mizuko.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that's why we have submitted additional peer-reviewed studies, papers that were published. This one in the International Journal of Protective Structures, not an ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers publication. And so we continue moving on, publishing peer-reviewed papers, as you saw last week, with the release of the Halsey report, which will be coming to regarding Building 7. Now, feature number 6, the total shattering of the structural steel frame. What are we talking about? The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says, look for the effects of explosions, shrapnel effects, high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances, as we've seen. Well, the shrapnel effects is exactly what we see in the World Trade Center towers. The steel frame is completely shattered. It's broken up, ready for loading and shipment, that steel. How about feature number 7? Is there a lateral ejection? Well, the NFPA 921 also says look for blast pressure wave effects, i.e. heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, like you see flying out of the South Tower and the North Tower in every direction, landing 300 feet in every direction. Back to forward. What's that? That's a freely flying structural steel section weighing 4 tons that is shot out horizontally, right there, horizontally. Then gravity takes over and brings it down to 45 degrees, as you see there. So what's really going on here? And by the way, why is it trailing thick white smoke clouds? We'll come to that in next week's look at extreme heat in this series. Gravity works down. Let's listen to David Chandler, physics teacher, to remind us of this fact.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. That is an extraordinary speed. In fact, that's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there's thousands of them, these perimeter structural steel sections. There's an incredible explosive force that's demonstrated here. And what did that explosive force do to the floors? I mean, there was 110 floors in each of these buildings. Each of them were an acre in size, 4 to 8 inch thick concrete, we're talking. So 8 inch thick in the mechanical floors, at least 12 or 13 of these floors were that. Where did it go? We should see pancakes at the bottom. On the right, a real gravitational collapse. On the left, the World Trade Center aftermath. Where are all the pancakes? 110 floors. We don't find them. Oh, there's the concrete being pulverized in midair. all the photos, all the videos show the incredible quantities of concrete being pulverized, sent out laterally, having been reduced to 100 micron particles. 90,000 tons of concrete in each building, laid like a blanket across lower Manhattan, up to 30% of the World Trade Center dust is pulverized concrete. Let's go to the governor of New York.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were lots of other things that were missing too. We'll get to that. But by the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete has been pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is crushing the building? It wasn't the steel. It's not the concrete. This is most of the weight of the building, 3/4 of it. Think about it. There must have been 10,000 file cabinets, but this is the only one that they found. It was in the basement from an ice cream store. How about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. You're saying that we have 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on the top of this building here. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because that sent its ejections out this way. They didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were blocked from reaching the Deutsche Bank building by World Trade Center 2. So they weren't from the people on the planes. Many of them were from firefighters, as we can tell by the red symbols. So they weren't even on site, of course, before the fires. So how did the firefighters' bone fragments get there? It must have been through those explosions. So we have 2,749 victims altogether, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for, vaporized. And distributed, the rest being distributed over an 800 foot distance away from the Twin Towers. How does that happen? We'd expect those bodies to be trapped between floors and certainly mangled badly, but not completely disappeared and spread out over 2,000 foot diameter around each of the towers. It can't be accounted for by collapse. Well, what we've seen so far is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. What about the first responders? 118 of them. We read you a couple of dozen. I'm not going to read you all 118. It's now 156 for the excellent research of Graham McQueen, who spent additional time in the last several years examining these reports. But there's another witness called the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which detected seismic waves near the time of both the airplane impacts and the collapse of the towers. The FEMA and NIST relied on these reports from Columbia University. So let's take a look at them. Now, at the time of the collapse of the plane impacts, they claim, well, these are due to the plane impacts. In the case of the North Tower, we're talking a 0.9 magnitude earthquake at the time of the plane impacts. And in the South Tower, we're talking about a 0.7 magnitude earthquake. And so we have a causal effect, it seems, right? Well, let's look at it in some detail. The plane hits at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But per the NTSB radar, which the 9/11 Commission relied on, that plane didn't impact for 14 seconds later. So how does NIST account for this discrepancy? Well, they said, well, look, we reviewed the videos and we think the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within 1 second, is wrong. And so we think it happened 10 seconds earlier. That's how they do their scientific method work. But they're still 4 seconds off, so what do? Watch. They go back to LDEO and contract privately and move the data back 3 seconds. Now they're only within a second. So this is the kind of scientific method that NIST is doing. How about the other airplane impact at the South Tower? It impacts at 9:02 and 54 seconds, and but the plane doesn't impact for 17 seconds later. What does NIST do with this discrepancy? They move but they study the videos, they say, and we think it happened 12 seconds earlier. Okay, you're still off 5 seconds. What do you do about that? Go back to LDEO, get them to move this data back also 3 seconds. Now they're 2 seconds off, but they don't worry about that. So that's the level of what we're dealing with. Well, what could have caused those explosions so many seconds before the plane impacted the building? Mike Picaro, 36-year-old father of 2. The whole building seemed to shake, and there was a loud explosion in the basement. The 2 arrived at the sea level. They found the machine shop gone. This is not in the official report, by the way, by NIST or FEMA. Nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press, gone. The 2 made their way to the parking garage, found it too was gone. The steel concrete fire door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil, lying on the ground. A bomb had gone off in the building, which is the basement. There's 3 other witnesses here that corroborate this. One, Willie Rodriguez, a janitor, who heard a plane hit after the bomb went off in the basement. And then these other 2 as well.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Okay, well, what can explain this? Well, let's go to Andre Rousseau. He says the frequency of the Raleigh waves for these plane impacts were on the order of 1 hertz. But aircraft crash impacts have frequencies above 10 hertz and often up to 100 hertz. But those are filtered out by the equipment used by LDEO. It doesn't even allow for the recording of such waves. So the seismic equipment is designed to look for explosions and earthquakes, not aircraft impacts. Besides, he says, the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground. So he says, well, let's look at what might have really happened here. With regard to the collapses, we have also the collapses occur near the time of the 2.1 magnitude earthquake in the case of the South Tower. In the case of the North Tower, it's a 2.3 magnitude earthquake. And so there's a few problems here, though. Once again, the surface waves arrive are at 10:28 and 31 seconds. The tower starts descending 9 seconds before that. Okay, but the first debris doesn't even strike the pavement. The lightest debris doesn't even start striking the pavement until 1 second later. And the heaviest debris, which is what NIST says was responsible for these seismic waves, doesn't hit until 4 seconds later. So what does NIST do with this discrepancy? Once again, they get LDEO in a private contract, which has no report for the public, which paid for it, to look at. And they get it they move it back 3 seconds. So that's called manipulating the outcome of science to achieve your objectives. What could be responsible? Well, let's look first of all at these very well-defined P wave and S wave, primary and shear waves, that were ignored, interestingly, by LDEO. They're very clearly defined. They occur before the surface waves. So that indicates something. And Andre Rousseau has pointed this out. 50 years of peer-reviewed reports on progressive waves and progressive mechanical waves in geology. That's 4 seconds before the tower even starts descending. So explosions are a likely outcome, cause. And in fact, Graham McQueen has done some very important work looking at the cameras that are on the ground that experience shakes both 6 and 10 seconds prior to the start of the tower's descent, just like the firefighters described. So it corroborates them too. Check it out. Here's the camera's still here. There's the shake, the big shake. And then 6 seconds later, the North Tower begins its descent. And so also in the case of the other camera from Etienne Soiree, the movie 24 Hours, there's a big shake right about there. And I'm not shaking it. You can watch this on YouTube. It shakes. And then 10 seconds later, in this case, the tower comes down. So that corroborates the first responders. How about at the South Tower? We have a seismic event occurring at 9:59 and 04. And the start of the tower collapses 5 seconds prior to that. But the debris, the first debris, doesn't even hit the ground until 7 seconds after that. So how can the collapse of the tower cause this seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer here yet again. They move the data back in time, and they say, "Oh no, we looked at the videos. We think the tower, the seismic signal actually happened later," and they get LDEO to confirm it in that report, which we can't get. And what could happen here? Oh, Graham McQueen has done another review of this New York camera 1 shake 3 seconds prior to the start of the collapse of the tower. Let's take a look. We have it's much more subtle. There's the shake right there. And then 3 seconds later, the start of the South Tower's collapse, corroborating the first responders and vice versa, which is important. So NIST says, well, this is due to the debris hitting the ground, but let's examine this from another angle. The concrete floors were pulverized to dust, as you saw. Dust hitting the ground over 3 square mile areas, not producing any seismic event. The steel frame is shattered into its individual units and peppering the ground with 4 or 8 ton small units. And they're not even peppering the ground, they're peppering the top of a concrete basement structure. So they're not producing any seismic component there, and it's over a period of 15 seconds. So, and it's equally distributed over the entire World Trade Center superblock. So no seismic activity. And by the way, we also have a problem here. Identical buildings, identical collapses nearly, producing 1.6 times greater energy one than the other. Yeah, 2.1 magnitude at the South Tower versus a 2.3 magnitude, which is 1.6 times greater energy than the 2.1 due to the logarithmic scale that we have that we use in earthquake engineering. So that makes no sense if it's to be explained by the collapsing towers. Andre Rousseau, author of 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. Identical buildings and nearly identical collapses cannot possibly produce seismic events of extreme different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Now, this is all summarized, this seismic evidence, quite nicely on the Consensus 9/11, the best evidence panel. Just Google Consensus 9/11, the work of Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. This is point TT7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. Very different than the structure that collapsed, by the way, at the Seattle Kingdom. Some people confuse these. It's quite a mistake to confuse these apples and oranges. Do the research yourself. I encourage you. I provide all the information here. What about the FEMA and NIST reports? Well, the NIST report had $20 million. They had their effort tasked by Congress was to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. Well, is that what they did? They have their own objective. It's hidden on page 82, footnote 13. What do they say? The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. For brevity in this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse initiation. It doesn't even include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wow. You had $20 million, 10,000 pages, and you have only a half a page on the events following the initiation of collapse. What were you tasked with? To explain the collapse. This is not rocket science. Structural engineers can do this. They simply say the structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below. Came down essentially in freefall. This is pure speculation. There's no analysis, no calculations. It's a pre-collapse report. Should have been titled the NIST report, a final report on the initiation of collapse. So we challenge them again and again and again. They say we're unable to provide a full explanation of the collapse. Really, any reasonable explanation at all. They said, gosh, NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when pressed, they finally admit they never looked for the evidence of explosive residues. You can't find what you're not looking for. Next week, we'll look for it, and you'll see that it was found by numerous scientists. What do the experts say? William Rice, structural engineer, one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near freefall acceleration, as if the 80,000 tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. It's again and again and again, we have structural engineers including those supporting the official story, who initially thought that they were that there were bombs in these buildings. They retract their statements again and again and again, like Ronald Hamburger, Mathis Levy, Mike Taylor. Experts like Andre Rousseau, though, come back and say, hey, even if the plane impacts in the fall, the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, they would have been insufficient to be recorded 34 kilometers away. That's 20 miles. So the destruction of evidence was immediate and complete. And structural engineers like this one complained about it again and again. The evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling. Bill Manning, crucial evidence that could answer many questions, is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't. We have 400 truckloads a day carting this to barges sent to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. So what have we shown today? We've shown the scientific method with the scientific method, the hypothesis corroborated of, well, you decide. You tell us in an email. We want to know what you came to. What we think we've shown is 10 key characteristic features. Well, today in part 2, 8 of those 10. We'll get to the other 2 next Thursday when we look at more evidence of extreme heat. But so far, this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. And normally we will take your questions, but we have some issues today, so we're not going to be able to do that today as we had promised. And we're sorry about that, but we ask you to go to the petition and sign up supporting the 3,000 architects and engineers. If you are an architect or engineer, sign on as an architect or engineer, demanding a new investigation, and support us by donating on our website. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're all over the country doing this work with 6 employees, and we've got to continue breaking through. We're supported by thousands of people who have become a member of AE 9/11 Truth at $5 a month. Now, if you can afford $5 a month, a cup of coffee, you can keep us doing what we do best. We're the tip of the spear of the 9/11 Truth movement, and we've got to keep going. You can volunteer with us. That's easy. Just do that on the website, if you will. And we've got so many ways you can help. There's ways you can help on your own. You can take the report from Leroy Halsey that we talked about last week on the finite element analysis of Building 7, which he's done an incredible job proving that fire didn't bring that building down, the third tower, to collapse on 9/11, that most people are completely unaware of. 47-story skyscraper drops like a rock straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint, which is why we're going to the Congress every year and multiple times a year. Right now, we're making appointments, telling them about the grand jury investigation, about the Leroy Halsey investigation that's been 4 years and has just come out, about the FBI lawsuit, and about our DVD 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which you can also yourself show this DVD. It's free on YouTube. Just Google it, Experts Speak Out. It comes right up. And get our DVDs, our 50-page book, Beyond Misinformation, at beyondmisinformation.org, our 2-hour lecture, our 15-minute documentary on Building 7 narrated by Ed Asner, all free on on YouTube. And join us next week on Thursday. We'll be back at 1 p.m. on Thursday Pacific time, and we'll look at the evidence of extreme heat, high-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite and nanothermite. Find out what that's all about. Today was part 2, the explosive destruction So I want to thank Andy and everybody. And we promise next week we'll take your questions and we'll catch up with you then. Looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.